And so this can lead to over-whipping, for example. So I already mentioned timing, but timing is incredibly important in reinforcement. If you don't time the positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement punishment to as close as possible with when the action actually took place, it can be extremely ineffective. But if you time it very close to when the action is taking place, it can be extremely effective. And in fact, they've managed to train all sorts of animals, all the way down to hermit crabs, fish, and so forth, by just getting the timing of the reinforcement right. So when it does, as soon as it does the behavior they like, they give it a reward, for example. And there's also a really important idea of consistency of rewards. So it turns out if you give a dog a treat every single time it sits, when you say sit, then it actually will learn very quickly, generally. But this behavior will get extinguished really fast. So if you start saying sit and not giving it treats, very quickly it will just stop sitting when you say sit. But alternatively, you can use what's called a variable schedule reinforcement. And here, what you're doing is it's sort of randomized. Maybe you give it a treat every third time it sits, but you do it in a random way, so you can't predict when it's going to get it. And with that schedule reinforcement, the dog will learn less quickly. But what's interesting is that its behavior will become extinguished less quickly. So it will go a much longer time sitting for free, basically, without a treat after you stop giving it treats. And so a lot of times what people will actually do is they might start it off on a consistent schedule where it's getting a treat every time so that it learns the basic behavior quickly, but then move to a variable schedule so that the behavior is maintained much better. And they don't actually have to reward every time without running the risk that it will just stop sitting in the future. And so some people have proposed that there's certain kinds of variable reinforcement going on in real life that actually might train us in some way to do different behaviors. So an example of this might be email. Most of the time we check email, it's sort of neutral. Every once in a while, it's a very positive experience. Even less often, it's an extremely positive experience. And so maybe one of the reasons people check email so often, I mean, I've often heard people complain that they're addicted to their email, is this variable reinforcement schedule, is that we're actually willing to go a lot of checks before we get a positive reward without extinguishing our behavior. Obviously, if email was never pleasant to check, we might check it a lot less. But because sometimes it is very pleasant, it perpetuates the behavior, perhaps. Slot machines might be like this as well. People might be able to, if they win once, they might be willing to go a really long time without winning, and they'll just keep playing and playing. Because again, it's the same mechanism. And actually, I've heard about this being used in video games. That they found that, let's say you're killing a creature in order to get gold coins. They found that if you kill a creature and say you get 1 gold coin every time you kill a creature, versus you kill a creature and 1/5 of the time you get randomized, you get 5 gold coins, that the second might actually lead to longer playing, and it might maintain the behavior of killing the creatures longer. All right, so now let's move on to sort of, the cognitive section of cognitive behavioral therapy. And so this was, the founding fathers of this were Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. This was in the 1950s and 1960s that they were doing a lot of the foundational work. This is actually one of the, so I should say cognitive therapy is very, very popular today. Even though in most movies and most depictions of therapy look nothing like cognitive therapy, they look like sort of more Freudian or psychodynamic therapy, it actually is really quite popular. All right, so there's some basic principles in cognitive therapy. First of all, learning to identify your thoughts and emotions, preferably as they're happening. So sort of being able to say, oh, I'm having a thought right now about this, or I just became angry. Also learning to challenge these thoughts, so not just take them for granted, but actually come up with a response to the thought as it's happening. And then learning to change your thoughts, change your beliefs about the world, and also ultimately with the goal of actually being able to change your emotional responses and your behaviors if there are behaviors that are having negative consequences. And I should mention also this is a really rationality-based therapy. A lot of it is around the idea of identifying distortions in your thinking and correcting them. And now, so one of the really important principles in cognitive therapy is this idea that between any event that occurs and your response to that event, there are some kind of thoughts. And these thoughts aren't necessarily explicit, but they might be just sort of what they call automatic thoughts or hidden thoughts. They're a thought that you sort of must have had. And so an example of this is, let's say someone pulls a gun and points it at you. And naturally you're going to feel afraid, right? You think, oh, that gun caused me to feel afraid. But really, there must be an intervening thought on some level. Like a child that didn't know what a gun was wouldn't feel afraid. You've probably never seen a gun before actually pulled on you, so you probably weren't trained in that sense to feel afraid. It's probably what's happening is you have a thought, implicitly or explicitly, that this is dangerous. But in fact, if you knew the gun wasn't loaded, you might not feel afraid. So again, the thought is going to be intermediate between the event and the way you feel about the event. And so this is a really important idea in CBT. And so I want to talk about some of the sort of things that a CT, cognitive therapy, some of the things that a cognitive therapist might try and train you to do, or some of the principles they might try and teach you. And I'm going to just use a simple example to illustrate this. So let's say that you're a lawyer, and one day you're at a party, and someone makes some comment about the legal profession and how they don't like lawyers or something like this, or they don't like the legal profession. And you start getting angry, and maybe this anger is detectable in your voice, maybe other people can tell, but you're not necessarily even aware that you've just become angry. So one of the things, so first, the cognitive therapist might try and train you to learn to detect these changes in emotion. So that in this case, you would actually notice as soon as you started getting angry. They also might try and get you to learn to figure out, maybe quickly identify what caused that emotion. In this case, you'd want to pinpoint that emotion to the comment that the other person made. It wasn't due to something else, it was due to this particular comment. Alright, so then talking about this idea of our thoughts being intermediate between events and the way we feel, the therapist might also want you to get to identify the thoughts that you had. Maybe you had a thought related, maybe you thought to yourself, oh, this person's trying to humiliate me by insulting my profession in front of other people. Maybe you didn't actually notice yourself having that thought because it was very quick, and usually we don't always notice our thoughts. Maybe it was even subconscious, but you could piece together that that was the thought that you must have had, maybe based on your experiences to other things that upset you. So you could sort of see a pattern, or maybe based on your behavior, you could piece it together that this sort of must have been an implicit thought that you had at that time. And then also the therapist might try and get you to learn to view your thoughts from an outside perspective. I mean, very often when we have a thought, the idea that we believe that thought is almost intrinsic in the thought. Like, you know, you think that person's an asshole, you believe that person's an asshole. Thinking it and believing it are almost identical. But you can actually take this outside perspective where you have the thought and you say, oh, I had this thought, this person's an asshole. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you believe the thought. You could still then sort of work with the thought, think about the thought, and so forth. Next, the therapist might try and get you to learn to identify distortions in your thoughts or in your beliefs. Basically looking for maybe a logical error, or maybe you're not examining all the evidence, and these kinds of ideas. And then to get you to explicitly challenge your thoughts, to actually maybe come up with responses to that thought at that moment, which actually maybe take some of the weight out of that thought. So in the lawyer example, maybe a response to this idea would be, well, you know, maybe they didn't know I was a lawyer and they weren't actually trying to be insulting. And maybe if you thought that to yourself, you'd actually feel less angry in the situation. And then finally, the therapist might try and get you to challenge your underlying beliefs. They call the core beliefs. So why is it that you suddenly got angry about this? You know, why did you suddenly have the thought that this person is trying to humiliate you? Maybe this actually comes down to some core belief you have about people trying to humiliate you, or about human nature, or something like this. And so the therapist could try to get you to challenge your thoughts or evaluate your thoughts around these core beliefs. Alright, so one thing I should mention is that I didn't actually believe that these distortions in thinking were extremely common. I didn't used to think that until I started studying cognitive behavioral therapy and becoming more and more aware of them. And what I started to realize is that, at least in me, and therapists claim this is true in almost everyone they work with, that these distortions in thinking occur very, very commonly. And especially when we're in times of high emotion. It's almost as if the emotion completely colors our view of reality. And as Paul Ekman put it, who's not a cognitive therapist, but he writes a lot about emotion, he calls it a refractory period. That when we're experiencing an intense emotion, we're almost incapable of having thoughts that are inconsistent with that feeling that we're having. And so the cognitive therapist thinks about there being a feedback loop. That you've got your thoughts. Like, say you have the thought, I'm a loser, right? And this thought makes you feel bad, puts you in a slightly depressive state. But the thing is that being in that slightly depressive state actually makes you more likely to have negative thoughts of other kinds. And so this may lead to another thought, like, you know, I'm so shitty, I'm probably going to fail out of school. because maybe you got a bad grade, which was what put you in a bad mood in the first place, or something like this. And this makes you even more depressed, and this can lead to still more negative thoughts. And so you get this feedback loop. And what cognitive therapy is trying to do in some cases is break this cycle. Try to get you to challenge that first thought, and so you don't get that change in emotion, which will lead to the next thought. And so it'll sort of break the cycle. And so, for example, like if you talk about depressed and anxious people, so depressed people tend to have very irrational thoughts that surround themselves, like their self-image, their experiences, like saying, I'm not going to enjoy this activity, and about the future. They tend to feel very hopeless about the future in an irrational way. Anxious people tend to view everything as being more dangerous than it is, or at least things related to their fears as being more dangerous than they really are. So the type of distorted thinking you have actually might depend on the type of emotion that you're feeling. Alright, so now let's talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, which sort of puts all these ideas together. Cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a set of techniques that were chosen from the two types of behaviorism that I mentioned, as well as cognitive therapy, and they're all packaged together in what they call CBT. And so it's interesting because there are actually multiple theories involved. It's not just one theory. There's behaviorism has different theories than cognitive therapy, but they managed to turn them into a set of techniques for treating specific disorders. They also, cognitive therapy, or cognitive behavioral therapy, very often comes with certain attributes. For example, homework. They almost always assign homework where you might apply some of the methods in your own time. This is unusual in other types of therapy. Most other types of therapy don't have homework. Also self-monitoring, which is basically recording something about yourself. For example, writing down the negative thoughts you have each day when you have them, maybe writing down responses to these negative thoughts, like challenges that you come up with to the negative thinking. And so this is self-monitoring is also considered a really important part of a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy. One nice thing about self-monitoring is it allows you to see if you're improving or not. But it also trains you to have more awareness, say awareness of the thoughts you're having as you're having them, or maybe more emotional awareness as well. So in terms of effectiveness, cognitive behavioral therapy is generally considered to be the most effective type of therapy for a lot of different disorders. It's actually been proven to help depression and a variety of anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety disorder, which is sort of like chronic worrying, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, some types of eating disorders, and it's also been applied to other disorders that are not anxiety or depression related, with maybe some effectiveness for some of them, maybe less effectiveness for others. But what's really interesting about it is it's a set of techniques that works for a lot of different things. Some other therapies have been shown to work for very, very specific disorders, but this seems to be pretty generally useful. And in fact, in my own life, I found that it's extremely useful not just for treating a specific disorder, but actually it can just help you control your emotional life, help you control your behaviors. And so I think actually it really can have practical benefits to someone who's not specifically suffering from a disorder. One thing to note is that people in cognitive behavioral therapy tend to care a lot more about evidence than a lot of other therapists. It tends to be a more evidence-based group of people who care about validating their theories, where there are a number of types of therapy where really they don't care at all about validation. Their clinical experience has already convinced them that their therapies work. And so that's another thing that differentiates this type of therapy. So there are tons of methods that cognitive behavioral therapists use, and I'm just going to focus on sort of three types of methods. One of them related to classical conditioning, which we talked about, one related to operant conditioning, and one related to cognitive therapy. So first, the one related to classical conditioning is known as exposure therapy. And this comes in two flavors.